The speakers will now take questions. There are two mics in the two aisles, and please line up, and may I request that you keep your comments and questions brief so that everyone gets a chance to get theirs in.
Back in the 1950s, when the first five-year plan was conceived, there are documents that, if anybody bothers to read, openly state that their conclusion was not to increase food production. I mean, the so-called Green Revolution was aimed precisely, in fact, it was done in Punjab, already had slight excess of production because they wanted even higher chance of producing for the greater excesses so that food would go to the markets and produce purchasing power among food producers to make the economy more consumerist. This is stated in plan documents, but I think this was not accounted for in Parliament. It was not put up for public debate. And it seems to me that this has been going on for a long time. There's really no difference between the planning process now and then, except possibly for the introduction of non-governmental plans.
I think that's a debatable issue. In the days of Nehru, in the 50s, for example, even with a thumping majority, which the Congress Party, which Nehru's party had, you had healthy parliamentary debates, you had parliamentary committees that were consulted with and whose recommendations were frequently taken seriously. In the past 3 years, for the most of the past 3 years, the Narasimha Rao government did not really have a majority, far from it being a thumping majority. Nonetheless, Narasimha Rao has had the impunity really to hardly be present in Parliament to answer questions. The Parliamentary Committee's report on the scam, the Harshad Mehta scam, has been essentially summarily dismissed by the current government. And last of all, it seems to me that the way in which, take for example, the national debate over GATT and the then Dunkel proposals concerning intellectual property rights, etc., were proceeding, it was simply unprecedented that that government should move discussion on these issues in Parliament at the 11th hour. I don't think this ever happened in Nehru's time. This is not to say, of course, and that part of your point is well taken, that indeed the organs of decision-making have always had a high degree of centralization, as Professor Chomsky was quoting Adam Smith as saying. But I think there is an important difference of degree which we ought to recognize.
Mr. Chomsky, with respect to Clinton's involvement in restoring Aristide to Haiti, do you feel this is a positive step in the right direction? And do you feel that he should be given credit for taking this against what I perceive to be not, he didn't have the support of the people because of just the way the media work and demonizing Aristide in the press?
Well, all you have to do is look at who's happy and who's sad. I think it tells you a lot. The happiest person in Haiti apparently is Fritz Mevs, who's the spokesman for the biggest and richest family in Haiti and one of the major coup supporters. He's in fact circulating tens of thousands of posters all over Port-au-Prince, welcoming Aristide and thanking Clinton for bringing him back and so on. And the reason is because he's literate, and he got rich by paying attention to what happens, and he can see exactly what's happening. Clinton consummated effectively the Bush-Clinton program, they really weren't very different, to try to destroy the Aristide government, which is exactly what they've done. First of all, it's not true that he restored Aristide. He put Aristide back for a couple of months, not for 4.5 years. They're always talking about the Constitution. It says he has to step down next December. It doesn't say that at all. The Constitution says that the elected president has a 5-year term. It doesn't say what's supposed to happen when 3 years of that 5-year term are spent sitting in Washington while U.S.-trained thugs are massacring destroying the popular organizations that elected him. Well, Clinton has his view on that, and 100% of the American press agrees with him. You have to go to Canada to find this not very profound observation made. He'll be back for a couple of months. Fritz Mevs is quite capable of reading the economic plan that was rammed down Aristide's throat, which says that, and a lot of nice words, but when you get to the central part, World Bank plan, it says something like this. This is almost exact. It says the renovated government will focus its energies on civil society, primarily the export sector and foreign investors. Okay, meaning U.S. investors are part of Haitian civil society, and in fact the privileged sector of Haitian civil society, but not the folks in slums or up in the mountains. They're not a relevant part of Haitian civil society. U.S. aid is now back with exactly the plans that it had prior to the election, namely cut back wages, drive people off the land so you have more cheap labor, turn Haiti into a export platform where you get women working, for 10 cents an hour, 11 hours a day, and so on. Yeah, they're back to that. They managed to, in fact, what they've essentially done is restore the, it's amazing that I have spoken about this around here. Some of you heard me talk about it, but immediately right before the U.S. forces landed, they landed on a Monday. The Sunday before that, the day before that, I happened to be monitoring the AP wires, figuring something's going to happen, and indeed something did happen. There was a huge story, the biggest story of the week, which has yet to appear in Boston or New York or Washington. The story was that there had been a leak from the Justice Department explaining the details of how oil continued to flow to Haiti during the embargo. Everybody knew that oil was flowing. In fact, Fritz Mevs was building a huge refinery, so obviously oil was flowing. Oil is the most important thing in any sanctions. And the oil was flowing. How? Well, it turned out that it was flowing with the authorization of the Treasury Department under the Bush and Clinton administrations. In fact, apparently right up to the end. Now, that's the story of the day of the intervention. What it said is there never were any sanctions. So whatever's going on, it wasn't that there were sanctions and now, we're restoring democracy. Something else was going on. Well, it would be unfair to say that the story wasn't published. I had a friend in the library do a Nexus search, and there was nothing on Monday, but maybe that was too early. But there was something on Tuesday. It was published in Platt's Oilgram, which is a journal for the oil industry. And on Wednesday, it got into some of the smaller journals around the country, like Dayton, Ohio, and things where people don't have enough sense, to keep out the wrong sort of things. But take a look in the Boston Globe or the New York Times. They're smarter. So far, we don't have that. But Fritz Mevs knows it. He knows that the Clinton administration, he also knows, as the press has also succeeded in suppressing, that U.S. trade with Haiti was not all that far below the norm under Bush and went up 50% under Clinton. It takes a 5-minute phone call to the Commerce Department to discover that one, but no reporter has yet found it out. The fact of the matter is pretty straightforward, I think. You can see it now. Bush, who was the Bush administration, when the election took place, they were shocked. Nobody was paying attention to what was going on in the slums. They didn't know that all these people were organizing vibrant civil society and so on. And they moved immediately to undermine it. Even during Aristide's term, the U.S. government did everything they could to undermine his government. When the coup took place, either with or without U.S. connivance, we don't know it yet, the Bush administration moved quickly to ensure that there would be no effective sanctions. Clinton simply extended that. In effect, they told the generals, look, you guys have a certain amount of time to decimate the popular organizations, intimidate them, kill off the leadership, and so on and so forth. And when it's done, we'll tell you it's done, and you can go off and live the rest of your lives in luxury and impunity, of course. And that's what happened. So that's what we call restoring democracy. Now we're back to where we were before the coup, before the election, in fact.
It seems that the people in Haiti seem to be
happy about it. They sure are. Yeah, I mean, suppose, for example, that you're being subjected to electric torture, and the torturer decides kindly to turn down the current. You'd be happy. I mean, that's incidentally why I wasn't personally against the intervention. Like, if the torturer asked me, should I turn down the current, I'd probably say yes. You know, I wouldn't feel very proud about being, you know, associated with the torturer.
Also, a question for Mr. Chomsky. Earlier in your speech, you revealed the aspect of the conservative movement exposing the poor more to market forces, while all about further sharing the wealthy from market forces through various capital means.
I'm sorry, I'm not catching what you're saying.
Oh, sorry. I was just trying to speak at this point, right? Earlier in your speech, that when the actions of the conservative movement was actually exposing the poor more to market pressures, market forces, while they're sheltering the rich from market forces through income tax cuts.
Yeah, these guys should not be called conservatives. I mean, whatever it is, you shouldn't tarnish the good name of conservatism by using it to refer to these statist reactionaries. They're all believers in powerful states.
Except don't we have progressive income
Tax?
income tax, and then
Well, not thanks to them. Not thanks to them. They fought against it, and besides, look, take, say, Massachusetts. It loses on the ballot every time under business pressure. And while there is technically a progressive income tax, which was finally achieved through a lot of popular struggle, they've been cutting away at it ever since. If you look at actual tax rates, you look at the percentage of one's income that goes to taxes, it's pretty flat across the income distribution.
Unfortunately, I have no idea that.
Well, the best place to look, the guy who did the most detailed work on this is a very, a real conservative in the real sense, Joseph Peckman. I think he's dead now, but he, for years, did analyses of actual tax distribution. And if you count in all the taxes, including the regressive ones, like sales taxes and stuff, it turns out, I forget the exact numbers, but it's, like at the very ends of the distribution, you get a little difference. But across the main distribution is pretty flat.
Across the main distribution and across the middle class.
Well, like you, I don't know what middle class means. I mean, middle class is just a term in the United States used to disguise the fact that most of the population is poor. You figure if you call people middle class, they'll somehow feel, okay, I'm part of things, So everybody says they're middle class, even if they're earning $5,000 a year,
I want to thank you for mentioning this news, which I looked up in the science library while Dr. Rao was talking. I wandered around and did all sorts of creative salamander graffiti with chalk, so it's easy to wipe off. A newt, in case you are curious, is a highly colorful salamander. And I didn't know that until tonight, and I thank the open library policy at MIT for allowing someone like me who's been diagnosed as from schizophrenic mother having tangential thoughts. Anyhow, what I've been doing is hanging out in the public documents room of the Boston Public Library. I started researching the electoral system of Washington County, New York, where my mother and I own land, and where I had to hitchhike 3 hours to apply for food stamps, which is a federal program which is guaranteed access by law to all citizens of the U.S. And I wound up actually looking for work. I have a teaching certificate in California, and I wanted to teach in my high school a substitute. And one of the high school teachers is like a personal friend, and I got 800 on American history. Anyhow, I couldn't get there because I had to hitchhike with my passport 3 hours to sign up to teach in a school I could walk to. And I wound up chained to the wall of the Port Police Station because I was silent when a police officer was yelling at me. And it's a whole long story, but anyhow, I decided to prove that people who have tangential thoughts and should probably be locked up can actually do something useful for society. What I've done is taken the census data, and I'm glad you mentioned the Commerce Department before because I believe that I can prove that there's been fraud committed by the Commerce Department, both in the Reagan administration and under Ron Brown, who works for the tobacco industry. It's a very long story, and I want to get the pictures in the color pictures in the physical record here, and anyone who can watch the tape. It's incredibly complicated to go into all the details.
Excuse me. Thank you. We have to have other people.
Can I present these maps into the visual record of this event? This is a fraud that was. This is a fraud that was. Did you get this on camera?
Yeah, I think they get it.
This is a fraud that was committed on the American people. People were required to give data about their ancestry. Okay. The green, is this on camera? Yeah, everybody can see the color. The green is the states where the people of German ancestry are the largest single group by ancestry, and the orange is the states where people of other ancestry, this is the official U.S. government term, other ancestry. You see Massachusetts and Rhode Island have an Irish plurality, Connecticut has a...
Right, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Can we give a chance to the gentleman?
Since the moderator decided to censor me, I just want to show what the U.S. government, who are the people that the U.S. government labeled others. This is easier to see because it's in black and white. The other people are the black color on this map here. And I don't know if it's a coincidence because social scientists who did this wouldn't pass any courses at any university that I've ever studied. And there's maps here. One last map here. One last. Can anybody see what this proves?
Yeah, if you put them on the table near the door, people can look at them then.
Done by Jesse Helms and New Green Bridge, who wants to take.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Literary for fascism everywhere.
If you consider that the economic policy of the third world in particular are dictated in part to a large extent by the rich countries, then and also if you consider the historic events and the policy, what sort of models of economic liberalization are
To whom do you direct the question? Okay.
Well, I think your question could be taken in two senses. One is, can third world countries such as India practice autonomous policy, autonomous economic policy? The other sense in which your question could be taken is what sort of autonomous So the other sense would be what sort of autonomous economic policy could countries like India pursue? Well, I'm skeptical on the first count, but I don't think it's impossible. It is no longer a bipolar world. I think one of the peculiarities of the Cold War period was that it did allow room, at least in the name of non-alignment or what have you, for some third world countries to pursue a course of autonomy within limits dictated by the world system. And I think it's much less practicable today than it used to be. But for the larger economies of the world, it's not impossible. And I would certainly hold India, China, Brazil, and Mexico, for example, to be large enough economies that they can pursue autonomous policy. Now, it's a different matter that some of them are simply not trying to do so. But the other question is really, it would take a whole evening, really, to get into. What is an autonomous policy? How does a country like India engage in such a policy? What would it mean? In detail, how do you practice it? I'd rather not take up that question in the interest of time. Thanks.
When I was listening to your talk, I got the feeling that you're really funny in the way you present stuff, and you make pot shots at the rich people and things like that. What do you think about the inertia in society?
About what?
The inertia in society.
The inertia in society?
And basically, I mean, are we ever going to be able to do anything about it?
I don't see any inertia in society.
Is this just intellectual?
What I don't know what inertia you're talking about. I mean, if there was inertia in society, we'd still live under feudalism and slavery.
No, I think what I'm saying is that this is not going to be easy to change. Whoever I can think of putting there, except maybe Mahatma Gandhi, is going to do just the same thing that what you're saying. And
Really?
so what is the final end to this?
The final end depends on what people do. I mean, there have been, throughout all of history, there have been popular movements that struggled against oppression and authority. Sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. If we want to learn something about how you do it, and if we want to learn something about democracy, we can look at places like Haiti, where in fact, while nobody was looking, a major and rather dramatic array of popular movements developed under the noses of the rich, and got strong enough so that they needed foreign power to crush it. Well, in the United States, there's no foreign power that can crush it. If we were willing to commit ourselves to freedom and democracy as much as impoverished Haitian peasants, we could change everything.
Yeah, but one of the arguments is that the people who are doing this, which is in the United States, are getting more and more powerful.
Who says? Who said? No, I don't think they're more. Look, they have power as long as you let them have power. There is no objective power in the hands of transnational corporations. If the population decides to dismantle them, they're finished.
Right, okay. And so if we all agree that what you're saying is right, that we are headed in the wrong direction, and someday somebody is going to come around and change the whole system of the other.
Not somebody's going to come around. It's going to be changed by a long period of intense popular struggle, which means education and understanding and organization and reforms and defeats and victories until finally you create a better world. That's the way everything's happened in history.
But you're saying that basically the rich people are in control, they don't want the poor people to come up.
That's right. That's always been true, and poor people have always come up. That's why there is a welfare state. That's why, look, in some ways, the situation in the world now has a kind of an eerie resemblance to what was going on in England around the 1820s. That's the period when classical economics was developed, the stuff they teach you in school, David Ricardo and so on. Now then it was England, now it's the world, but that aside, it's very similar, and it's kind of interesting to see what happened. Like maybe people were asking your kind of question then. Around 1820, this was the period in which, it was the period of ascendance of modern capitalism. That meant you had to destroy people's belief that they had human feelings, and that they had what was in fact called a right to live. You had to eliminate the idea that there's a right to live. So when you read the classical economists, like say David Ricardo, they say it's an infringement of natural liberty and even science to mislead people into believing that they have rights other than their rights on the labor market. They don't have any human rights. And he says that's as certain as the principles of gravitation. And out of that comes the whole, there's a labor market. The way Malthus put it, he's famous for the stuff on population, but he was a major economist. He said if you don't have inherited wealth and you can't survive on the labor market, then go somewhere else. Okay, and somewhere else meant in those days go to the colonies where they've exterminated the population so it's open. Well, they finally won. Like in the 1830s, these guys basically won. They took political power. They were now in a position to create a world, it was just England then, in which you had no human rights except the rights you got on the labor market, and your choices were try to survive on the labor market, go to a workhouse prison, or go somewhere else. Perfect victory, great free market victory. The only trouble was that the British Army was at that time involved mostly in putting down riots, and within a couple of years they had the Chartist movement. And the labor movements began organizing, and pretty soon people got scared, because they realize that we can deny them the right to live, but they can deny us the right to rule. Well, the science, fortunately, is very flexible. You know, it's not like physics. You can adapt it as you choose. So the science changed. And by the time you get to the mid-century, people like John Stuart Mill, or even, you know, conservative economists like Nassau Senior, they discovered that there is a right to live. And you start getting what becomes the foundations of the modern welfare state. Well, that's what happened then. Now it's being tried on a world scale. You could ask the same question in England in the 1820s.
I mean, one case is that, you know, just one last one case, you know, in the labor system that you're saying, that the labor got organized and they came up, and then again you see the same thing.
You don't see the same thing, you have different things. No, you don't. You always, there is always going to be, you know, until we finally get to utopia, there will always be some form of authority and power, but less and more benign and more diffuse. Democracy has extended, autocracy has declined. It's not a straight path upwards, like we happen to be in a path downward now. But that's a constant struggle all through history. I don't understand your point. If you're saying, how can we get to a perfect world where nobody is unpleasant to anyone else? Well, I don't know how to do that. How can you make changes that'll make things better? We all know how to do it.
This is a question for Noam as well. It seems that two of the issues that our corporate media is gripped by these days are crime and immigration. And I wondered if you could...
crime and what?
Immigration.
Immigration.
If you could point us to a few bits of the documentary record that pretty much completely contradict what's mainly the mantra of the mainstream media right now on both crime statistics and how they've changed in the last 50 years, say even 2 decades, and the amount of media coverage. Not that we're going to hear too much about white collar or corporate felons, but also the immigration and immigration of corporate wealth.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, you know, immigration is a big issue in places like, say, California, but countrywide, it's crime and welfare that are the two big issues. And as far as immigration goes, I should say, you know, corporations are very split because they need the cheap labor. On crime, there's good work. Some of the best work is actually the best work I know is by a criminologist named William Chambliss at George Washington University. He's one of the main criminologists who also, incidentally, has been running quite interesting studies in a project with the Washington police force, where law students and others go around in police cars and just take transcripts of what's happening and so on. And the general fact, which everybody knows, in fact, is that crime statistics haven't changed a lot in the last 20 years or so. The perception of crime has changed. I mean, there are some changes here and there, but fundamentally it's about the same. In fact, violent crimes have been even declining. As he points out, in fact, it's not true that the concern over crime compelled the government to take steps. It was quite the other way around. Hysteria over crime was whipped up by Richard Nixon and, you know, a lot of right-wing Democrats and so on. You can understand why. It's functional. There is a growing superfluous population. Since the 1960s, real wages have either stagnated or in the Reagan years actually declined. There are more and more people around who are like those people who Ricardo was talking about. You know, you can't survive in the labor market, go somewhere else. Well, there's nowhere to go now. So what you do is lock them up. And in the Reagan years, the incarceration rate tripled. Well, these are the basic facts about, and it was not because of crime. In fact, most of I don't have the exact numbers in my head now, but an extraordinarily high number of the people in jail are there for non-crimes. They're there for what they call victimless crimes, like possession. You know, you got a joint in your pocket. That's simply a technique for throwing the black population in jail. Chambliss concludes on the basis of his own studies, which are the most intensive I know, that the police have simply declared the black males a criminal population. However, I don't think he's exactly right. If you look at his data, that's not true, because criminals have constitutional rights. And as he shows, they do not regard the black population as having constitutional rights. So these are, you know, there are if you call me sometime, I'll give you references. But he's got, they're very good studies where people go with the police and see what they do, and they don't treat any black person as having constitutional rights. Break into houses, you take people out, you toss them in jail. We passed South Africa and Russia back in the mid-'80s in per capita imprisonment. Actually, last year, you'll be happy to know that we went back into second place. Under the capitalist reforms, Russia is now a little bit ahead of us in locking up its population. They're sort of learning our values as we're trying to teach them. But we passed them in the 80s. And this huge growth of crime has nothing to do with the increase of crime, and in fact, it's not even aimed at dealing with it. So, for example, if you look at the people in crime, most of the people in jail are for drugs. But if you look at who's in jail, it's not, you try to find, say, bankers or chemical company executives. Anybody who's involved in the center of the drug racket, they are. Like, most of the big banks are involved in money laundering. The chemical corporations, the CIA pointed out years ago that they're sending down to Latin America chemicals way beyond the level of anything that's needed for industrial purposes. And if you look at what they're sending, it's, the kind that they use for high technology relatively high technology drugs like cocaine processing. Do you see those guys in jail? No. What you see in jail is black kids who they can't figure out anything else to do with. If it was Brazil, you would send out the death squads.
Just real quick, I was wondering with statistics about the crime rate of the last 2 days.
They come from the FBI. Yeah, they come from the FBI. The FBI publishes regular records, and it's, it varies a little bit, but it's pretty flat. No major changes. There were big changes around 1970 or so, but there haven't been recently. And in fact, the last couple of years, violent crimes actually declined. That's not to say that crime isn't a big problem. Like it's terrifying a lot of people and making their lives impossible. But the crime war isn't intended to deal with that. It's just bypassing it completely. And of course, I think you mentioned white-collar crime before. That's not even considered a crime. In fact, the drug laws are very carefully crafted for class interests. So take, say, cocaine. There's totally different laws for crack and powder. Crack cocaine is very severe crime. That's the drug of choice in the ghetto. Powdered cocaine is the drug of choice out in the white suburbs. Virtually no penalties. It's all crafted on very sharp class lines.
I have a question for you now. How do you change? While being reasonable, those of us who work for change, how do you change, or at least enlighten the American people? What about the concern for control of information? All our newspapers and our television shows and so forth, and all of the information, especially the example that you gave of Haiti.
Haiti, yeah. Well, it's we all know how to do it. I don't understand the question. There are people on the Boston Globe, for example, who would be happy to publish the truth. They're not going to be able to do it unless they have public support. Public support means pressure. It means people going to the editorial office every day and saying, how come you're publishing these lies? Why don't you just publish this, let's say. And for example, the Boston Media Group, which unfortunately isn't working anymore, but when it was working, just a tiny group, it's just did some media monitoring, was already scaring the local papers into, changing what they were doing. It doesn't take much. The most dramatic case is one that's in the front pages right now, East Timor. East Timor is now on the front pages. Just yesterday, although I don't know if they reported it, 2 days ago, 2 American reporters who a lot of you know, Alan Nairn and Amy Goodman, were arrested in Indonesia because they're trying to get to East Timor again. They tried to have a press conference in Jakarta, and the security forces dragged them away right in front of the cameras and so on. But East Timor is on the front pages. Like the Globe has had an op-ed the other day from one of the main activists. They've had good editorials. That happened because about 10 people were working on it in the country. It doesn't exist. Did East Timor exist? You can't imagine anything more marginal than East Timor. That's because people don't. That's because people like us don't do what people did about East Timor. That's the only reason. It's not, I mean, look, it's not going to happen. They have no interest in pointing out that the worst human rights violator in the hemisphere is Colombia, and it gets more than half of our military aid going up into Clinton. What interest do they have in publicizing that fact? Any more than they had an interest in publicizing the fact that the U.S. was the main supplier of Indonesia for its near genocide in East Timor. They have no interest in that. But in fact, with popular effort, you know, these facts get out. They don't get out if you sit in your room somewhere. And it's not that there's any secret. Everybody knows exactly how to do it.
The only what about the transfer of assets?
What about what?
The control of money going from countries, individual countries, to world organizations like the World Bank. What kind of effect is that going to have?
Look, there are a lot of popular organizations. There's a 50 Years is Enough campaign going on now, which has all kinds of local groups operating on it, which is concerned with the World Bank. It's educating people about it, it's publishing things, it's, I mean, it ranges from calling for an end to the World Bank to radical modification of it. That's the way you educate people about these things. What other way could there be? I mean, how did the solidarity movement for Central America develop, which included hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, and had a big effect? You know, it did not happen by people sitting in the room and asking, how do I do something about it? We know how to do it, you know.
Before you sit down, two quick questions. The first has to do with overpopulation getting a bad rap these days, being linked to a lot of social evils that we're seeing. Could you comment on that? The second has to do with the fact that December is coming in a month and a half, and we're going to see Christmas time. These malls is concentrating on the kids at Christmas Carol. It's not concentrating on Derek's Christmas, it's not concentrating on the children dying in the streets in industrial Britain. Why only on Tiny Tim and not on the actual facts of what happened back in the
Usual. For example, people are going to be buying toys for Christmas for their children and their children's friends, and they're not going to be paying a lot of attention to the fact that, I forget the number, but I think it's maybe 80% or so of some high number, percentage of those toys are being made in East Asian crematoria, you know, literally, where women are locked into factories and burned to death if there's an electrical switch breaks, like in Guangdong province and in Thailand and so on. You know, they're not going to be paying attention to that when they buy the toys. I mean, maybe they'll look and see if the blood's washed off or something. Well, I know it was a rhetorical question. You're not really asking me for the answer. These are things that people should know. As to, what was the first question? Overpopulation. Well, actually, there was a very good study of that, and what I'd recommend, since there isn't much time, I think it was very good, by Amartya Sen. You know him, he's an economist over at Harvard. It was in the New York Review a couple of months ago. He's an extremely good economist who's done very good work on this topic, and he just went through in detail what everybody knows who's looked at it. If to the extent, if women have opportunities and education and so on, then fertility drops. So in India, there's one state, one of the poorest states, isn't it, Carol? Must be one of the poorest states, which has, I think, one of the highest literacy rates, and you know, especially for women and so on, and fertility is way down. You know, it's very poor. And then you don't have to kill people. You know, you don't do anything like that. You just have to create opportunities. In much of Europe, population growth is actually negative at this point. The genes didn't change. It's just that people have opportunities and choices, and you know, they decide not to have 6 kids. If you're a poor person, it makes a lot of sense to have a lot of children. Who's going to take care of you when you get old? You know, maybe some of them will survive. You know, like my mother's family. You know, I mean, they all talk about blacks and so on. I'm an Ashkenazic Jew. You know, we're supposed to be the highest IQ, this, that, and the other nonsense. My mother's family had 11, well, that I know of, 11 kids. I'm not sure how many because nobody counted the ones who died. You know, well, because they were an East European family, and you just had a lot of kids. That's the way you survived. You know, a lot of them died, some survived, maybe some of them take care of when you're older, you know. Yeah, you want to get rid of the problems of too much population, create decent circumstances for people to live in. Incidentally, the problems of the world are not due to overpopulation. So the problem of overuse of resources, for example, which is real, has nothing to do with population. I mean, it's rich people like us who are using the overwhelming mass of the resources. You know, and if you want to cut down the problem of overuse of resources, cutting down the birth rate in India has almost nothing to do with it.
Thank you.
Dr. Chomsky, we hear your speech and a lot of other people addressing or articles addressing this topic. We hear a lot about the macro social institutions, the government, the rich being responsible for the human suffering that's going on in our own country and around the world. But isn't it really the case that each of us here is really more responsible for those macro social institutions? I mean, are you willing, am I willing, are we all willing to give up our $60,000 a year, or whatever we may be earning, and go down to the level of about $15,000 or $20,000?
Who says, first of all, who says there would be any sense in doing that?
Well, what if we, instead of, if we earned that 60, why don't we give $25,000?
Well, you can if you want, but that's almost useless, you know.
I don't think it is.
Yeah, it is, because the effect, if you were to give away, let's say you earn $60,000 a year and you decided to give $55,000 of it away, the effect of that on changing the world, if you did that, would be virtually undetectable. On the other hand, if you and I and other people work to change social conditions, the effect can be very great. And there's no particular reason why incomes should go down.
But is it in fact the case that we don't need, a person doesn't need to earn $60,000?
Sure. Yeah, in fact, you're probably worse off if you earn big salaries. But these are individual choices which are almost irrelevant to what happens to people in the world. I can say it because it's true. For example, if you decide that you're going to live as a hermit on a desert island, the contribution that you will be making to people starving in the streets of Brazil is zero. I can say it because it's true, and you know it's true.
Social theory is very relevant here because we all live in a system.
Okay, if you don't understand that it's true, you tell me how you would help children starving in the favelas of Rio if you decided to live on a desert island. How would you help them? Would they be any better off?
Well, possibly if you use less resources, they might be.
They would be better off if you stopped using resources?
Yes, very possible.
Well, you know perfectly well that that's totally irrelevant. I mean, the problem for them is not that they would have no more access to resources if you decided not to have a television set than if you do decide to have a television set. Oh, if you shared your resource, not one person. Yeah, but then it's not a matter of an individual, because individuals can do almost nothing. What you can do is, as a group, change social policy. For example, if you want to affect the people in Brazil, change the policies of our government, which we're responsible for, which are driving them to that state. That will have an effect.
You're assuming that social change begins at a group level, when in fact it can begin at individual.
It ends at it. If you think that it begins at, yeah, if you want it to begin at individual level, that's also where it ends. If I were, running the world, I would love people to have the proposal that you're making. Because if individuals decide to do something alone to help people, you can be sure that that's not even going to be a pea on a mountain. The way changes take place is when people work together to bring about significant changes in social policy.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Well, then how are we disagreeing?
It's ironic because I just did give up my $60,000 job here recently, and the only significant effect I know so far is I'm not poor. But I have a question for Professor Chomsky. My question is basically, every once in a while I do run across someone who doesn't see eye to eye with you. There are actually a lot of people like that out there. I
I don't think that evil has a lot to do with it. I mean, let's suppose, I'm not sure I understand what you're saying. Let's take, let's take some institution that has power, like say General Motors, okay? Totalitarian institution which has a lot of power in the world. Well, it has a board of directors. Now, does it matter whether the people there are nice guys or bad guys? I mean, they have a certain institutional role. If they stop playing that institutional role, they'll be kicked out and somebody else will be put in. If you could have a golf date with one of the directors of General Motors and you convinced them, look, what you ought to be doing is using your resources to improve the working conditions of the workers and making better cars cheaper and so on. Suppose you convinced him. Fine, then they throw him out and somebody else comes in. I mean, because it's an institutional fact that the guys who are running that thing are going to be increasing market share and wealth.
Yeah, I guess I don't see as much of a blatant instance of the kind of thing that I really find hard to explain in the corporate world today, so much as maybe in the Defense Department or in the top policy.
Same in the defense. Look, I have friends who, I know people who were so working in the friends actually, who were working in the military system. And, you know, just, actually some of them are right around here. Like Henry Kendall, who's a Nobel Prize winning physicist here, was inside the military planning system and decided at one point he just didn't want to be part of that. Okay, and there are plenty of other people like that. So, okay, they drop out, but the system doesn't change. Now,
people who don't drop out, is that saying, let's get more specific. Okay, Guatemala. Now, there are people who are responsible for the policy in Guatemala.
That's right.
How do they justify that?
Oh, that's easy. Try reading Himmler's diary someday. Go to the it's useful. Go to the lower depths of the human species and look at what Himmler was writing about. He was describing how courageous he is and how honorable and how he's defending human values and, you know, protecting the fundamental, you know, principles of the highest civilization in the world from this, that, and the other thing. He even had distinguished philosophers putting it in 10-syllable words for him, like Heidegger, who was explaining in the peak of the Nazi period how, Germany represents the civilization of the Greeks and is the inheritor of the civilization of the Greeks, the only authentic civilization, and has to defend it against the barbarians of East and West and so on and so forth. I mean, you know, there's nothing you can't justify. I'm sure you probably believed it. You know. What does that have to do with anything? It has nothing to do with it. Look, every one of us knows from our own experiences that people can internalize beliefs that are useful to them, okay? And it's, you know, one of the things you naturally want to do is find those beliefs in yourself and help other people find them and dismantle them and try to see the world as it is. But it doesn't have a lot, you know, there are evil people, but the problems we're talking about don't have to do with that. They have to do with institutional structures. Like when Adam Smith was talking about the merchants and manufacturers who are designing state policy in their interests and harming the people of England, he wasn't saying, look, they're immoral people. They're not. They're just working within an immoral system. And anyone who works in it is going to do harm. So change the system. You convince one of those people, somebody else comes in and takes their place, because these are institutional facts.
I would just like to note that today is a momentous day, that the video cassette of manufacturing consent has been released.
Yeah.
On my way down here today, I stopped in Portland at a video store where they're going to have it. I stopped in Portsmouth in a video store where they're going to have it. And I encourage everyone here to go to your local independent video stores and demand that they get manufacturing consent, the catalog section, every other videotape that you know gives our view. But I just wanted to make sure people knew that that tape was being released today and to go to their video stores. Thank you.
Could you give a brief assessment of the condition of the United States economy, and do you feel that it may be prone to collapse? And if so, what do you think that's?
The what of the U.S. economy?
Brief
brief analysis.
The condition of the U.S. economy, do you feel that it may be prone to collapse? And if so, what can happen?
Well, that's a big subject. I mean, I think it's obvious that that the trends are all downward. It's also been clear for the past 20 years that real wages haven't gone anywhere. That the position of significant parts of the population has actually deteriorated. And meanwhile, you can see also in the saber rattling of our economic policy makers and leaders in this country vis-a-vis their competitors abroad. In fact, Clinton claims that his main mission in Southeast Asia is to make Southeast Asia safe for U.S. exports. That's an example of what I mean by saber rattling and imposing voluntary policies favorable to the U.S. on other countries. These are all signs, I think, of declining competitiveness and so on. There's nothing inevitable about this. I don't believe that this is all fated and so on. So by the same token, I don't think there's anything inevitable about a collapse and the date of the collapse. It seems to me that you know, much like any third world country, whether the U.S. can do something about these problems will very much depend on how their political systems operate and whether the people will become more proactive and exercise their rights and powers and make the right policies happen. To just give you one example, the graduated tax in Massachusetts was shot down under a barrage of ideological claims that this would destroy or marginally destroy the Massachusetts economy, even though you know the only basis that exists suggests, in fact, the opposite conclusion. It was well financed. The campaign won out, and the people of Massachusetts have lost out. Here's an example where if people you know will wake up and do something about it and not buy, for example, the contract on America, then I think something can be done. So none of this, again, is inevitable. I don't know if that answers your question.
Would you say that we could arrive at a, let's say, ethical economy without revolution? Really think we could achieve an ethical economy through reform?
I think if and when.
Is there anything here in the current economy to work with if we could actually come up with an ethical?
If and when an ethical economy comes into place, that would be a revolution, well, for sure. Now, well, what sort of revolution must precede that revolution, I think, you know, is something that we can think about, talk about, and do about. And again, nothing is foreclosed. It isn't clear to me that everybody should do just one sort of thing in order to create the revolution. I think creating the revolution takes all kinds of talents, all kinds of people, all kinds of you know, actions and activities. And so, you know, it's not obvious to me that there is one blueprint kind of solution for getting from here to there. It's going to be difficult. I mean, that much is clear, but I don't think there's a single path converging onto the what you call ethical economy.
On behalf of the Alliance and everyone here, I would really like to thank our two speakers. Thank you very much.
Turned out that it was flowing with the authorization of the the Treasury Department under the Bush and Clinton administrations. In fact, apparently right up to the end. Now, you know, that's the story of the day of the intervention. What it said is there never are any sanctions. So whatever's going on, it wasn't that there were sanctions and now, we're restoring democracy. Something else was going on. Well, it would be unfair to say that the story wasn't published. I had a friend in the library do a Nexus search, and there was nothing on Monday, but maybe that was too early. But there was something on Tuesday. It was published in Platts Oilgram, which is a journal for the oil industry. And on Wednesday, it got into some of the smaller journals around the country, like Dayton, Ohio, and things where people don't have enough sense, to keep out the wrong sort of things. But take a look in the Boston Globe or the New York Times. They're smarter. So far we don't have that. But Fritz Mevs knows it. He knows that the Clinton administration, he also knows, as the press has also succeeded in suppressing, that U.S. trade with Haiti was not all that far below the norm under Bush and went up 50% under Clinton. It takes a 5-minute phone call to the Commerce Department to discover that one, but no reporter has yet found it out. The fact of the matter is pretty straightforward, I think. You can see it now. Bush, who was the Bush administration, when the election took place, they were shocked. Nobody was paying attention to what was going on in the slums. They didn't know that all these people were organizing vibrant civil society and so on. And they moved immediately to undermine it. Even during Aristide's term, the U.S. government did everything they could to undermine his government. When the coup took place, and it says something like this is almost exact, it says the renovated government will focus its energies on civil society, primarily the export sector and foreign investors, okay? Meaning U.S. investors are part of Haitian civil society, and in fact the privileged sector of Haitian civil society, but not the folks in slums or up in the mountains. They're not a relevant part of Haitian civil society. U.S. aid is now back with exactly the plans that it had prior to the election, namely cut back wages, drive people off the land so you have more cheap labor, turn Haiti into an export platform where you get women working, for 10 cents an hour, 11 hours a day, and so on. Yeah, they're back to that. They managed to, in fact, what they've essentially done is restore the, it's amazing that I have spoken about this around here. Some of you heard me talk about it, but immediately right before the U.S. forces landed, they landed on a Monday. The Sunday before that, the day before that, I happened to be monitoring the AP wires, figuring something's going to happen. And indeed, something did happen. There was a huge story, the biggest story of the week, which has yet to appear in Boston or New York or Washington. The story was that there had been a leak from the Justice Department explaining the details of how oil continued to flow to Haiti during the embargo. Everybody knew that oil was flowing. In fact, Fritz Mevs was building a huge refinery, so obviously oil was flowing. Oil is the most important thing in any sanctions. And the oil was flowing. How? Well,
for the most of the past 3 years, the Narasimha Rao government did not really have a majority, far from it being a thumping majority. Nonetheless, Narasimha Rao has had the impunity really to hardly be present in Parliament to answer questions. The Parliamentary Committee's report on the scam, the Harshad Mehta scam, has been essentially summarily dismissed by the current government. And last of all, it seems to me that the way in which, take for example, the national debate over GATT and the then Dunkel proposals concerning intellectual property rights, etc., were proceeding, it was simply unprecedented that that government should move discussion on these issues in Parliament at the 11th hour. I don't think this ever happened in Nehru's time. This is not to say, of course, and that part of your point is well taken, that indeed the organs of decision-making have always had a high degree of centralization, as Professor Chomsky was quoting Adam Smith as saying. But I think there is an important difference of degree which we ought to recognize.
Mr. Chomsky, with respect to of Clinton's involvement in restoring Aristide to Haiti, do you feel this is a positive step in the right direction? And do you feel that he should be given credit for taking this again?
The speakers will now take questions. There are two mics in the two aisles, and please line up, and may I request that you keep your comments and questions brief so that everyone gets a chance to get theirs in.
Back in the 1950s, when the first five-year plan was conceived, there are documents that, if anybody bothers to read, openly state that their conclusion was not to increase food production. I mean, the so-called Green Revolution was aimed precisely, in fact, it was done in Punjab. Already had slight excess of production because they wanted even higher chance of producing for the greater excesses so that food would go to the markets and produce purchasing power among food producers to make the economy more consumerist. This is stated in plan documents, but I think this was not accounted for in Parliament. It was not put up for public debate. And it seems to me that this has been going on for a long time. There's really no difference between the planning process now and then, except possibly for the introduction of non-governmental plans.
I think that's a debatable issue. In the days of Nehru, in the 50s, for example, even with a thumping majority, which the Congress party, which Nehru's party had, you had healthy parliamentary debates, you had parliamentary committees that were consulted with and whose recommendations were frequently taken seriously. In the past 3 years,
what I perceive to be not, he didn't have the support of the people because of just the way the media work and demonizing Aristide in the press.
Well, all you have to do is look at who's happy and who's sad. I think it tells you a lot. The happiest person in Haiti apparently is Fritz Mevs, who's the spokesman for the biggest and richest family in Haiti and one of the major coup supporters. He's in fact circulating tens of thousands of posters all over Port-au-Prince, welcoming Aristide and thanking Clinton for bringing him back and so on. And the reason is because he's literate, and he got rich by paying attention to what happens, and he can see exactly what's happening. Clinton consummated effectively the Bush-Clinton program. They really weren't very different, to try to destroy the Aristide government, which is exactly what they've done. First of all, it's not true that he restored Aristide. He put Aristide back for a couple of months, not for 4.5 years. They're always talking about the Constitution. It says he has to step down next December. It doesn't say that at all. Constitution says that the elected president has a 5-year term. It doesn't say what's supposed to happen when 3 years of that 5-year term are spent sitting in Washington while U.S.-trained thugs are massacring destroying the popular organizations that elected him. Well, Clinton has his view on that, and 100% of the American press agrees with him. You have to go to Canada to find this not very profound observation made. He'll be back for a couple of months. Fritz Mevs is quite capable of reading the economic plan that was rammed down Aristide's throat, which says that, and a lot of nice words, but when you get to the central part, World Bank plan,